All right, everybody. Well, welcome back to week two of digital learning, our new reality, learning online. Anyway, so welcome back to this week. Hopefully, everybody had a relaxing weekend, and we got a big week planned coming up here. The lesson today is basically going to be our final lesson in this industrialization segment, which means I'd like to give a little quiz on Tuesday just to kind of get a pulse for where we're at. And you'll get some directions as to how to take that quiz on your computers on Tuesday. So look out for that. That'll be basically Tuesday's lesson. We have kind of hopefully come to the conclusion at this point that for so many countries around the world, their whole development strategy is based on being able to industrialize, right? At least on a small scale, or at least on some scale. We've talked about some of the difficulties, right, that come along with just development as a whole, right? Especially when you're trying to base it off of, developing your country's economic capacity through industrialization. But really, the two biggest challenges that any country is going to face in terms of development strategies are either really these are the two big challenges: adopting policies that successfully promote development, like actually having successful development policies, if not industry what, right? And then two, finding the funds to actually pay for that, right? So those are the two kind of challenges that we're going to be looking at here in our final lesson of this industrial piece. And the reality is that countries are generally going to choose one of two models to promote development. One approach is going to basically emphasize international trade and getting involved in sort of the international arena. This is what a lot of newly industrializing countries are going to do. And then the other sort of advocates self-sufficiency. So what is that? What are we talking about when we're talking about development through self-sufficiency, or what I like to call the self-sufficiency approach? Well, for most of the 20th century, self-sufficiency was the more popular of the development alternatives. China and India adopted this strategy, as did most African and Eastern European countries. So what this approach basically includes is this: countries are going to set barriers that limit the import of goods from other places, whatever those barriers might be, right? Heavy taxes, right? Like tariffs, taxes on imports, right? If you level heavy taxes on imports, people are going to be less likely to be able to buy those outside products, right? Which kind of keeps outside countries' products out. Could be quotas, could be requiring licenses that are very hard to get in order to export your products into other countries. The other element of the self-sufficiency approach is that new businesses are oftentimes nursed to success by being isolated from competition, especially isolated from competition with large international corporations. Which basically encourages a country's fragile businesses to achieve their own independence in their own niche markets. A country in the self-sufficiency model is going to spread investment as equally as possible to all sectors of its economy. And incomes in the countryside, well, we want those incomes in the countryside to keep pace with those in the cities, right? And so really the goal here is the reduction of poverty, right? Reducing poverty really takes precedence over encouraging a few people to become wealthy consumers, yeah? So that's kind of the way the self-sufficiency approach works, right? Countries being able to rely on themselves for their own development. And for many years, India was the leading example of the self-sufficiency strategy. For example, to import goods into India, foreign companies had to secure very hard to get licenses. And if they got those licenses, the quantity of goods that foreign companies could actually sell into India was pretty restricted. I mean, you see evidence of that in India even today, right? You see a lot less foreign business in India than you're going to see in a lot of other places. The government also imposed very heavy taxes on imports, very heavy tariffs which would double or triple the prices on goods coming from foreign markets. Indian businesses were discouraged from producing goods that they would export. If a company wasn't able to make profit selling goods only in India, the government would step in and basically subsidize them. Yeah, the government would step in and basically provide whatever money they needed. Or, maybe it was just simply providing these businesses cheap electricity or wiping out their debt so that way they didn't feel compelled to have to sell to foreign markets. The government owned a lot of business in India as well. I mean, India was never a socialist system per se, but the government owned a lot of businesses from communications to transport to the electric company to even car and insurance companies. The government was deeply involved in ownership of, right? And so that's what the self-sufficiency approach generally looks like. Now, in the 1980s, there was a movement that emerged known as the neoliberal movement. And what the neoliberal movement basically did is it emphasized free market approaches and participation in global trade. It was based on the idea essentially that government intervention into markets is not very efficient, it's not very desirable. Government intervention into markets should be resisted whenever it was possible, therefore transferring economic control from the state to the private sector, right? And that this would essentially foster economic globalization. Now, the international trade model of development calls for a country to essentially identify its distinctive or unique economic assets. In other words, what does my country have to sell that the rest of the world needs? What product can the country manufacture and distribute at a higher quality and lower cost than anybody else, right? Because once you can identify that, now you can jump into the global market. And the sale of these products in the world market would bring funds into the country that could be used to finance other development, right? Essentially, the Rostow model that you guys learned recently follows this general line of thinking, yeah? And we have seen several countries that have pursued this way of thinking to their advantage. Yeah, we've talked about the four Asian tigers already, right? South Korea, Singapore, Taiwan, and Hong Kong, right? Adopted this international trade alternative. And it was largely influenced by Japan's success in doing the same thing not long before. These are countries that have concentrated on textiles, on electronics. Low labor costs have enabled them to sell their products inexpensively to MDCs, yeah, and much to their advantage. Not left out, of course, of this conversation should be also oil-rich states in the Arabian Peninsula. This region was one of the world's least developed until the 1970s, when escalation of oil prices transformed these countries, in some cases overnight, into some of the wealthiest countries in the world per capita. And they've used, petroleum revenues to finance large-scale projects such as housing, highways, airports, universities, etc. Now, of course, there's problems with both approaches, right? I mean, if you want to identify a problem with the self-sufficiency approach, there's a couple of issues here. One is general levels of inefficiency. Self-sufficiency protects inefficient industries. Businesses in this approach are going to sell their product no matter what. No matter if the product is good, no matter if the product is bad, no matter if the service is good or if the service is bad. So, I mean, what incentive do these businesses really have to even improve the quality of their products or lower production costs or reduce prices or increase production? They don't have any incentive to do that, right? So it ends up becoming pretty inefficient from a business point of view. I mean, the other problem here is large bureaucracy, right? Very, very large government, right? Self-sufficiency requires a large bureaucracy, a large system of government workers to administer the controls. And sometimes a very overly complex administrative setup from a government standpoint can actually encourage abuse and corruption in the system. Now, that doesn't mean that the international trade alternative is perfect, certainly not. One of the things that we've seen out of the international trade approach has been a general uneven distribution of resources around the world. LDCs that depended on the sale of one product, they found that one product that they felt they could sell to the world. A lot of times what ends up happening is these countries end up suffering because the price of whatever that product is, whatever that commodity is, doesn't rise as rapidly as the cost of products that they need to buy, that they need to import. For example, Zambia is a great example of a country that has extensive copper reserves. Zambia hedged its bets on the sale of copper to the global market and the production of it, but it's really largely been unable to use copper to promote development because of the declining price for copper in the world. So that's an issue. And so what that also additionally can lead to is a lot of dependence on the developed world, right? You build up a handful of takeoff industries that sell to people in more developed countries. Sometimes what this does is it forces less developed countries to cut back on the production of their own food, of their own clothing, their own necessities for their own people, because they're trying to sell to the global market. And then funds that are available might have to be used to buy these necessities from MDCs, right? So what you end up with is this almost dependent relationship on the more developed world. And let's not forget market decline, right? Countries that depend on selling low-cost manufactured goods find that the world market for many products has declined sharply in recent years. We saw this during the Great Recession of 2008, that a lot of the manufactured goods that were being sold by other countries, the market was kind of lost for those products for a while as people in the United States and other countries were experiencing bad financial times. This could easily happen again with the impending recession due to coronavirus possibly, right? But we'll have to wait and see. It's kind of hard to tell, kind of hard to forecast this at this point, right? But the earth is very, very tied together financially. And so, the global trade approach sometimes can leave some countries in the lurch. That said, despite its problems, the international trade approach has been the one embraced by most countries as the preferred alternative for stimulating development. In fact, we talked about India as an example of a country that really, was kind of the poster child of the self-sufficiency approach. But India actually switched to international trade after witnessing the success of other countries some decades ago. And since adopting this approach, India's GNI per capita at PPP actually increased 6.5% a year, compared to 8.5 or compared to 1.8% rather, with the self-sufficiency approach. To promote international trade, and this particular development model, countries representing 97% of world trade established what was called the World Trade Organization, the WTO, in 1995. And what the WTO basically does is it works to reduce barriers to international trade in two ways. One, countries negotiate for at least the reduction, if not the elimination, of international trade restrictions like tariffs and promoting more free trade. And then the other thing that the WTO does is it enforces agreements, as one country can basically bring to the World Trade Organization an accusation that another country has violated an agreement within the organization. And then the WTO can rule and charge. The WTO, the World Trade Organization, certainly has its critics. There's no doubt about this. Sorry, let me back up for just a second. The critics come from both sides of the aisle, realistically. Liberal critics have charged that the WTO is undemocratic because the decisions that the WTO makes are decisions that are made behind closed doors. And so these are decisions largely being made to promote the interests of large corporations rather than poor people. There is no democratic process in this. Conservative critics, on the other hand, have also charged that the WTO compromises the power and sovereignty of individual countries because it can essentially order changes in taxes and laws it considers unfair to trading practices. And in some cases, this actually challenges the sovereignty of countries. And, conservatives have generally been very critical of this over the years. But anyway, come what may, how can countries finance their development once they decide to pursue the international trade approach? Where does the money come from? How do you pay for this? We'll talk about this in part 2.